back to Sister Radio. I'm Aqui. I hope you're all doing well and you're taking very good care of yourselves. I'm sending you a big virtual hug and lots of love, and I hope you really enjoy episode 5. If you are joining us for the first time, a big welcome to Sister Radio. We bring to you new episodes every full moon and every new moon. Each episode, I'm joined by a different sister for a conversation where we share our experiences and thoughts on everything, including art, activism, growing up, work, and of course, reading books written by female authors. Sister Radio is a podcast by Sister Library, a community-owned, community-run feminist library in Bombay. If you like what we are doing here, please share Sister Radio with your friends and your family so that we can reach more people. For today's episode, I'm so thrilled to have my sister Sheelasha join me. Sheelasha Rajbhandari is a visual artist, a cultural organizer, and co-founder of the artist collective Artry Nepal. She is also co-curating the upcoming Kathmandu Triennale. In her practice, she frequently tries to encounter the simple yet socially forbidden and taboo subject matter with a focus on women's struggles, celebrating their resilience. Her works explore the current transformation of Nepal from a once important center for trans-Himalayan trade to a geopolitical situation in flux between the two emerging world powers of India and China. Sheelasha has received national and international recognition and has exhibited her works globally. Alright, let's start the conversation. Hi Sheelasha, welcome to Sister Radio.
Thank you for having me here.
So great to have you. Can you tell me where you're sheltered right now?
I am in Kathmandu and we have a shared studio with the members of my collective Artry Nepal. We're all living together at the moment and caring for each other.
That sounds so wonderful. It's like a dream to be sharing spaces with other artist friends. How has the situation been there? It's pretty hard here in India right now.
It is definitely a bit frustrating also given the fact that it's not just the COVID, but it's all the reaction it is having. It's the lockdown, it's the unpredictability. And after all these months of lockdown, the cases are still rising. So in the initial phase, a lot of people who were working in the cities had to go back to their respective places walking, and some of them had to walk like 19 days, 20 days. Some people came from India because of exhaustion, died right in the border. Unemployment rate has increased a lot. Suicide rate has increased a lot. Yeah, and then this happened right 5 years after the major earthquake, which we had in 2015, and we haven't yet healed from that wound of the earthquake yet, and then this is happening. A lot of things, the situation, it's not entirely new, and COVID-19 cannot be blamed for what is happening because it's just like sort of highlighting or like just exaggerating what is already there, existed, all those discrimination, all those gaps in the society. It's just exaggerating it.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's been such a difficult time. How are you taking care of yourself during this time?
So luckily, we've been together, like living together, and we were able to sort of emotionally and mentally support each other. But this situation was a bit different from the earthquake time, because in earthquake, we went out there and we do whatever we could. But in this time, because of the unpredictability of the situation, because you yourself can be the host, there are a lot of things, and then we couldn't be as active as before in so many other cases when we used to be. But then also in the name of lockdown and COVID, there are other many things are happening. So those are the things we're sort of trying to address and help in a way with the help of other activists.
Wow, yeah, that sounds absolutely amazing. What are you working on right now?
Currently co-curating Kathmandu Triennale. And this situation has we had to reinvent so many ways of working. But I'm also working in my own projects. But then the situation, of course, has been very challenging. We have to rely on the online platform a lot. But then, as we know, it's not practical in so many ways. So we're trying to reinvent or invent different mediums, different technique, and different strategies to work to continue.
I'm so excited about Kathmandu Triennale. It's so great to have you and Hitman curate it. It's not very often, actually, it's not ever that we see indigenous peoples leading, especially when it comes to art, and definitely in other spaces too. We hardly ever see indigenous names, and having you as curators of one of the major art spaces in the South Asian region, that is so refreshing and that is so great. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the kind of works that you bring in for the Triennale.
At the curatorially, we are looking into artists who are generally not kept in the fine art, like not perceived inside the fine art bracket. And also, a lot of artists are not from Kathmandu or not from the cities themselves. So, like, a lot of people don't have internet. So that is another layer of challenge, including the challenge which is there are artists who are from diverse ethnicity, diverse indigenous group, and who speak diverse languages and dialect. That is another layer of challenge added, the lockdown and challenge in mobility.
It's really wonderful to see that you are really looking at finding representation for different groups of indigenous peoples, because that's also really rare.
Yeah, and it's also like when there are representations, it's very problematic kind of representation because it's either very exoticized or it's like tokenistic or very tourist centric or very patronizing, and it just to have representation is not enough. To have what kind of perspective is that, what kind of intention is there, and also to have that intellectual ownership coming from the community themselves and not upper caste people owning that. It's multiple layers which we have to be really careful, and we're trying to be careful in this and sensitive in the Triennale, and we're so very much trying to focus upon first person narrative. The artists themselves come from the family lineage, and they're speaking from themselves, and because we're sick and tired of the gaze, So.
Yeah, I feel like you being the curator of the Triennale also takes away the burden from the artist to have to perform for a non-indigenous curator who oftentimes does not have the knowledge of indigenous practices or has not unpacked her or his own privileges. And like the indigenous artist oftentimes has to perform and present their works, our works, in a way which is acceptable to them, which ticks their boxes, and that is violent. Yeah, I feel like just by you occupying that space, it already is helping indigenous artists thrive.
Yeah, there definitely is there this very preconceived idea and imposed colonial nationalistic ideas of what art should be, especially in indigenous communities. The process of knowledge transferring is happen through performative practices, oral histories, material history, and a lot of artworks are also ephemeral, and then it might not necessarily have human figure in it. That definitely is very different from what art institute and educational institute is boxing, framing what art is. And if we see the history of educational institute themselves, it is of course very colonial. We are following that colonial legacies. And then there's another layer where there's this idea of what is art, what is craft, what is higher art, lower art. There's this idea where art in one point became collection material, when the colonization were happening, that social and communal values of art was sort of taken away in exhibitions like World Education Forums, etc. And then that definitely had distorted the relationship between people, community, and art. And that fragment is definitely there, and we can definitely not undo the history. So to exist between all these dimensions and parallel realities is also challenging in a way.
Yeah, I totally get it. It is really difficult and quite precarious space to exist, given the geographical location that we are at, where we have resisted and survived cultural genocide as indigenous peoples. I think it is a difficult space when we start articulating within this space, especially with all of the works about us seems to portray the idea or push the narrative that indigenous people are a thing of the past, like we are some relic and not really existing, thriving, living cultures of today. I have had a constant unease when navigating art spaces, and like even with some of our own people showing images where I feel like, wow, this is not made keeping us in mind, but for a different viewership who would be comforted by the idea that we are not present anymore. So, in that, how do you reconfigure and re indigenize art practice and art spaces, especially given that there is a market that demands you to do certain things, but there's also your ethics and morality as an indigenous person. So I wonder how you navigate through this.
Through our collective Art in Nepal, we come from 5 indigenous community: Gurung, Tharu, Tamang, Limbu, and Newa. And that in itself, in our initial phase when we met and when we started to work together, and we started to realize that we're so similar to each other, but yet we don't know each other at all because we've been brainwashed with certain education all our lives. And then, it's such a difficult process to rediscover your own roots. And especially, like you said, there has been strategical genocides, strategical removal and erasures of your history. There were times where speaking your own mother tongue could take your life. So there's like entire process of unlearning and relearning. But then that discovering process is extremely difficult because the history has been erased. And for us, like at the moment, our best way of understanding ourselves has been to go to the communities, our own communities, each other's communities, like be very close to the activists who've been risking their lives. We were trained in art school and had certain education, and that definitely shaped our understanding of art. And at the same time, there is this entire global art moments, which I think is very interesting, how indigenous communities from all around the world are trying to reclaim their identities, trying to create their space, reclaim their spaces. And this idea of contemporary art is also becoming very diverse in a non-cliche way. We're living in a very interesting art time. It is actually really important not just to imitate the symbol or even recreate the symbols, but then to live the ideologies, that intangible things, and the tangible things are reflection of those intangible things. And within my own practice or in our artist collective, this is something we talk about, that the system itself and the reason behind it. We do create something, but why are we creating it? It's so important to reflect back, to have a critical perception toward. We are very egalitarian, and then the decision making, we have no hierarchy and everybody have their own vote. And then we share resources. That is the most important thing we do, and which has been sustaining us. And that came very organically within our group. It was no strategy. We don't have 5-year plan, 5-year strategy. Most of us, we were reflecting back to our own ancestral practices and our own community lived within the tribes, how they coexisted with other tribes, how our community and neighborhood functioned. And we're like, maybe it came very naturally. Often when we think about the past, we only think about a kingdom, a king, Raja and Janta, things like that. But then when we go back to the oral history, there were democracies and there were elections and there were cooperation, how everybody had share and then how that share were redistributed, and when there were profit, then it was used for the betterment of the community. And it is so inspiring. And I'm trying going back to that level, not just depicting or recreating, but then how to inspire from that social coherent self.
Absolutely. You've just so beautifully stated it that we had a system in place that was a brilliant system that is developed through years and years of practice. And then instead of upholding these systems, we are forced to practice systems of injustice through either the Varna system or through the European system of domination. And when things are failing, we are told that the system is failing. Why does it surprise people it's failing? It is not an organic system. It's not a system that was created by the people from the subcontinent, by the indigenous people. It wasn't. So it's bound to fail. Also, it's super backward in the sense that how limited it has been for women within these
exactly.
systems. It's so backward.
I mean, this is also something like I had this conversation like just recently yesterday with one of our members who was Tamang, where like in Tamang community, it is still, I mean, patriarchal, but then there are so many other things where women were the lead, where women had a lot of freedom, which is reversed now in very recent years. So like, for example, women didn't have to change her surname or her like family spirit. They had right for divorce. There was no system. There's no word for widow at all. And then choose their like partner. And now in recent time, the women are taking husband's name, which is totally unnecessary. So there are a lot of things which is actually reversing for indigenous women, which is very sad. It is, first of all, the Hindu system, which was forced for 250 years and still is very active in a way through the government. But it's also the media. It's also how all this Hollywood, Bollywood are stigmatized, and there's so much taboo. There's a creation of taboo which didn't existed before.
It's just so annoying and also exhausting to see this happening every single day. Anyway, let's talk about your childhood. Tell me, where did you grow up? How was it when growing up?
My father died when I was really young, and then I was raised by my single mother and then my matriarchal grandmother. It was very disorienting years because the society we were living in, the system we were following were very patriarchal. But at the same time, I was raised by this leading women's but then their contribution were never acknowledged. So my dead father was more important than my living mother and grandmother, who were giving blood and tears and sweat to raise us. There was also taboo around reclaiming your womanhood also. For such a longest period of time, I avoided that very consciously also. And also in terms of how I dress, because I faced it very directly when my father died, and that absence of male figure. And then femininity almost became, I tried to sort of avoid femininity. Also, in a younger time, we didn't have exemplary, like idol women. Like we were all surrounded by, in the schools, colleges, art colleges, everywhere, men. Later on, I slowly started to understand myself, research a bit, meet feminists, understand the movement. And it took me some time because there was this lot of taboo around it also, no? There's a perception towards a feminist or female. And then later on, slowly I started to sort of talk to my own grandmother and my own mother. And I started to talk about my grandmother's grandmother. And I discovered so many things which was never, first of all, acknowledged within my own family because they were females. And then this sort of discussion also doesn't happen normally also in the society. equality. Also in the feminist movement, a lot of the movement are also like especially first wave feminist women are also driven by caste Hindu, like upper caste Brahmin and Kshatris, and and they have a completely different sort of conversation. And so yeah, and then I started to collect oral history, and I made a series of work dedicated to my grandmother and her grandmother, so almost like 5 generations of women till me. I also started to understand this relationship between the landscape, city, and a woman's existence within there, and how exactly same incident in the history is perceived very differently by a male and a female member of my own family, and why did that happen, and how within their own family they had resisted so many things. That became my source of inspiration. Nepal was also going through civil war, so those were my teen years. So it officially started from 1996 and ended in 2006. The reason it started was because of this hundreds of years of domination and marginalization of hundreds of communities, indigenous communities, Dalits, Muslims, whose voices had been strategically erased, and who were basically, the fight was for the identity. Like in terms of like the understanding of people, those were such an important shifting years. The history of feminism also, like how women were not part of armed force, but the Maoists were taking the arms, young woman Maoists. Those were the years where people were discussing about their identity, their rights. And as a young kid, our education system were very brainwashed, followed panchayat system of one nation, one language, one dress in such a diverse community. And we were brainwashed that Nepal is one of the most peaceful countries, where everything is okay, everything is all right. But then in reality, of course, it's not. So those were the transition years, and that definitely made me realize about my own identity also. And also it happened to be that when I joined Lalit Kala campus, I took sculpture as my major. So my campus happened to be in the center of the city next to Ratna Park, which was where the most protest and all this thing happened. So we used to be sort of reading inside, and there used to be protests outside. We faced that very directly. So we were reading about Renaissance art, Van Gogh, all this thing, and what was happening in reality was definitely very, very different. So that was the time we started to think about our own artistic practices, the materials we were using. And after that, there was a peace process. Of course, all these sacrifices people have made, or so many people died, so many people got disappeared. But the reason for what people fought for also disappeared. And again, people from higher caste came into the main party. And there was another moment from the indigenous community where again people were dissatisfied and talking about, okay, it's not over and we haven't really been acknowledged and identified. And so it was at that time that people were talking about how many indigenous communities are there, how many diverse languages are there, which is very different from what mainstream media used to feed. So it was almost one of the first time in the history. So this sort of discussion happened in the student level itself. Now reflecting back, those moments definitely shaped us, feed us, nourished us to what we are now.
Wow, that is super intense, and I can't even begin to imagine what a civil war for such a long time must have felt like. And post that, there was indigenous resistance. Always a difficult time to explain to people about indigenous people in the South Asian region. Would you say you've had that experience too?
Saying coming from Nepal, like there's another layer that when we talk about South Asia, people in general just think about India and then Pakistan and then Bangladesh. And so these 3 countries are like the major conversation. And then a lot of discourses also around partition stories, Hindu-Muslim stories. But then of course there's so much of diversity and intensity and so much of other layers of history. People don't recognize these things. And coming from Nepal, that is like this first thing. And then indigeneity is another layer. And of course, Nepal quite does not neatly fit into the colonialized country. It was not directly colonized by the British. But then the indigenous community here, of course, thinks the Shah kings were the colonizer. And to communicate that complexity is definitely a challenge.
Yeah. I can imagine, especially within India and like, the relationship between India and Nepal, it's very tricky because every time people think of another Nepali person in India, they imagine that they are Hindus
Mm.
because like Nepal was also recognized as the only Hindu country in the
Yeah.
world. Like it's really absurd that Nepal having such a large indigenous people's history and history of resistance, their image to the world still remains to be as a Hindu country.
Yeah, it's either Hindu or Buddhist. One of the pride of Nepal is that Buddha was born in Nepal. But within Buddhism also, when we met, we had also discussed about nature worshipping religions, like Bon religion had been forcefully converted both into Hindu and Buddhist. I mean, Buddhism has very violent history, and it's not just the peaceful religion as projected in the world. The problem is that the indigenous community themselves don't know how to access their histories. There's very less resources, and this idea of we are all Nepali, this nationalistic idea, and that definitely becomes difficulty in understanding your own bloody history of oppression.
Yeah, absolutely agree with everything that you said. I also think that with us, it's
Yeah.
difficult to accept our history of oppression because it's not a history that is over and done with. It's
Yeah.
an ongoing
Yeah.
oppression that we are
Yeah.
living every single day. Accepting that is
Yeah, exactly.
traumatic.
Yeah. There is a stone in one of a neighboring city of Kathmandu, which is within the Kathmandu Valley, but it's a different city. It's called Kirtipur, and it's believed that the stone is related to the Shah king who conquered the Kathmandu Valley. And till this date, people go there and spit on the stone, expressing their frustration. So the spitting thing became also sort of an organized thing in the day where the Shah king was born. So people go there and spit or in an organized manner in the Shah king's birthday. And recently, Prime Minister got so scared of people just spitting that he sent armed force to guard the stone so people cannot spit there.
What? What? Really? What? Isn't your prime minister communist? What is this
Of
really?
course, our left is
Wow.
our right, almost.
Yeah, quite an example to show to the indigenous people that it does not really matter left or right, it's all the same for us. Okay, I'm going to take you back to work again. Tell us a little more about Kathmandu Triennale. What has your work been like curating Kathmandu Triennale so far?
It has been amazing. Curatorially, Hitman and I, we are co-curating, and Cosmin Costinas from Parasite is artistic director. And so initially we had Kathmandu Triennale 2020, but then early this year we redid our visual identity and we decided to decolonize the calendar system itself. So from 2020 Georgian calendar, we came into Bikram Sambat calendar. So in Nepal, we are in the year 2077 right now. I mean, having said that, we have a lot of different calendars within Nepal itself. 2070 calendar is the formal one. So starting from it itself, we have decided how can we decolonize the concept of art? How can we acknowledge the diverse form of artistic expressions? How to acknowledge the struggles and resistance the indigenous communities are having in this time? How indigenous artists are visualizing their future through indigenous futurism. How does queerness and femininity and feminism and matriarchy exist within this? So these are the things we are working on, and it's almost like a constellation where it has like all these sections have their own independence, but at the same time it's very interconnected. And in terms of artists, we have traveled in different parts of Nepal which luckily we could do before the lockdown happened, but we had to cancel a lot of our travel as well. We also traveled in different parts of the world through our own projects, and a lot of artists, we've been knowing them from more than a decade. Also, some of them we came to know through our research. It's also sort of important that how you mentioned earlier that when we are talking about various form of expressions and indigenous expressions, we really have to be sensitive on like how that connection is happening and how that interpretation is happening. Because within the indigenousness, all certain countries have more power or more economic capability to power their indigenous community. Certain countries, when you call yourself indigenous, you can be marked as anti-nationalist, terrorist. So there are different layers of sensitivity within that. There are certain privileges within that. Not to repeat the cliche again is also very important.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're doing, and I'm in awe of you in a time when just existing as an indigenous woman is in itself an act of defiance, and it needs so much courage. I can't even imagine how it must be feeling to occupy this space of power and having to balance all of these different aspects of being indigenous and being mindful of what you are trying to show. It must be really hard.
Yeah, it is hard. Well, it is almost like and I see it almost like a protest also in a way, but as an artistic protest.
Yes, so this is the perfect opportunity for me to ask you about your favorite books written by female authors.
There's this book which is very emotional and very strong. There was a workshop organized by Voices of Women Media, and the workshop was facilitated by Veronica Coy, which is like strong, unapologetically feminist poet. And the workshop was of all female victims of civil war who were affected, who were tortured, who were raped by mostly by army, and some of them by the Maoist also, because in the war, like rape and torturing woman's body is used as a weapon. And then there are the survivors. They published a little book called Maunadi, Chronicles of Silence, which just gives me power every time I read it. And it is published by Chetana Publishers. And there's another book which is called Pehchan Ko Khoji, which is edited by Kailash Rai and published by Indigenous Media Foundations. And it is a collection of different articles about indigenous women. And it's very rare to have that collection all written about indigenous women. So yeah, I think I gave both the books, both Pehchan Ko Khoji and Chronicles of Silence,
It's
I think.
true. You have very generously gifted us these books. If anyone would like to have a look, these copies are in the library. Please feel welcome to come and stop by anytime you'd wish once we reopen after the lockdown.
Yeah.
Is there an organization or like a group that's working during this time that you would want to give a shout out to?
So there is this organization called Sano Paila, which is based in Janakpur and Pirganj, in southern part of Nepal, which is neighboring to India, and that is the most affected area in terms of like COVID. And currently, they're doing amazing job. So yeah, they're doing great.
Do you have a word of advice for young indigenous female artists?
I think it's really important to first of all listen to your mothers and grandmothers and really broaden our own understanding of art and our own ancestral practices. Because the world can be so distracting and the world can be so strategically manipulating, and to have connection with our community first is very important.
That is such an important advice. It's so important for us to also keep reminding ourselves to foster connections and to honor connections that we have also. Thank you for such a brilliant advice. Now, how can one be a sister supporter?
There's so much of thing we can do, but just I think to embrace each other first of all, and to listen. There's no space to listen nowadays, and to talk and share first of all, and then everything will just open up.
That's so important. I can't stress how important communication is. Communication is key. That's such an important thing. Thank you for sharing that. And finally, tell us where our listeners can reach you.
I am in Instagram and Facebook, and I have a blog which I don't update a lot, but I'm really active in Instagram the most.
Yeah, I think that brings us to the end of this episode. I am so grateful that you could join us today, Sheelasha. I love you and I love your work and I appreciate everything that you do, and it's so wonderful to see you thriving, and it fills my heart with so much warmth and joy to see you and to be able to call you my sister. Thank you again for making time, and I love you so much.
And thank you for creating like spaces like these. I mean, you work directly in the community, and also like spaces like this where we're so like distanced from each other, but then creating like safe space where we can share and talk and express. Thank you for creating spaces like this.
Of course, I'm so glad you could join us. The conversation that we had today is everything, it's just everything. And I have so much to thank you for, and just so much love for you in my heart.
No, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to be part of this sisterhood. No, seriously. I'm seriously so happy to meet you. You cannot believe how happy I am.
Same. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of Sister Radio. You just heard a conversation between me, Aqui, and Sheelasha Rajbhandari. Her social media info is in the show notes. Please make sure to give her a follow and check out her work. If you like to follow Sister Library on Instagram, we are sister.library. On Twitter, we are at Sister Library. If you'd like to write to us, we are ilovereadingwomen@gmail.com. And if you'd like to support our work, please make sure to check out our crowdfunder. The link is in the show notes again. Music for Sister Radio is composed by my sister Shasha Patel. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you again for tuning in, and until next time, keep celebrating women.